Good morning, friends. In Sunday's message, one of our final points was that God has not revealed how he can ordain all things while mankind still exercising free will. Now, to be fair, we can understand some of the how. For instance, we define free will as choosing and pursuing what you want. And so when God ordains things, he decides they are going to happen, but when they happen, insofar as they involve humans making choices, those humans do generally make the choices that they make because it's what they want to do in the moment. It really is according to their own desire, their own free will. So God ordains it, and in that moment, man desires to do whatever that is. And we saw that God may ordain it to happen according to one motivation, his own, while man desires it based on an entirely different motivation, just as Joseph's brothers wanted to sell him into slavery for their own evil desires to get rid of him, but God ordained that it would happen for his own good purposes. So we do understand a certain level of how all of this works together. But the underlying mechanics of how God's sovereign decree interacts with man's free will, that's the part that God has not revealed to us. We don't know how that works at that deeper level. But what I want to talk about today is actually the why, not the how of how everything works out, but the fact that God has revealed the why. Because obviously God ordains all that he does for a specific purpose. And so if we were to ask, why does God ordain all things that he does? Why does his sovereign decree include people that will rebel against him and so receive condemnation as a result? Well, he gives us the answer to that question. And we see that answer in Romans 9, because in Romans 9, throughout the chapter, the Apostle Paul talks about how God ordained that Pharaoh, if you remember back in the book of Exodus, Pharaoh played a certain role in oppressing the people of Israel so that God could then demonstrate his power in freeing his people from that oppression. And yet when you go back and read the account of what actually happens, it becomes very clear that even though God ordained that Pharaoh play that role, Pharaoh did all that he did from his own motivation. So the sovereignty of God and the free will of Pharaoh all at work at the same time. But then, back in Romans 9, the Apostle Paul basically anticipates a certain objection in light of this. And so he writes, "You will say to me then, why does he, God, still find fault? For who can resist his will?" In other words, people were objecting to Paul's teaching about the sovereignty of God back then, just as they object to it today, saying that if God ordained Pharaoh to be like this, then how can Pharaoh be held accountable for being like that? Why would God make people that he not only knows, but that he ordains will reject him and oppose him and oppress his people and therefore receive condemnation for those things, even if they do it according to their own free will? Why would God make people like that? Why would God ordain such a thing? And Paul's answer to this is very clear. He writes, "But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? What is molded say to its molder, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use?" Now, there's more to his answer to follow, but we already get this idea that we must keep in mind the distinction between God and us. He is God. He is the creator of all things. And not only is he the creator, but he has the right to create as he wills. Because the creator doesn't create things in a haphazard, willy-nilly, purposeless fashion. Rather, there's a design and a function to all of it. As Paul goes on to say, what if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, in order to make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory? You see, God creates as he does so that all of his own attributes can be put on display. Because that's what everything is ultimately about. God making himself known and displaying who he is in all of his glory for all of creation to perceive. And therefore, God's power, and yes, even his wrath, had to be made known. And therefore, there needed to be those who would receive that wrath. And so he created people that, of their own free will, would reject him. And he left them to that free will that they would reject him. And he was under no obligation to do anything different. He gave them the ability to choose, and they chose to go against him. Again, doing so out of their own desire, not compelled by God, not forced by God, not coerced by God to do it in any way. But God still created them with that free will, because in revealing his wrath toward them, the riches of his glory would be all the more highlighted for those who would receive his salvation. And so why does God ordain that he will leave some in their rebellion while he will change the very nature of others so they will freely choose him, so that his glory can be known in its fullness, so that the riches of his glory would be made manifest, particularly in those who receive his mercy? Because again, the greatest good is that God be made known, that his character and attributes would be known by all of his creation, from his wrath to his grace and mercy. And also, again, we are reminded that man's free will is not violated in any of this. Those who reject him do so out of their own desire to reject him. Those who submit to him do so out of their own desire to submit to him, having their natures changed by God so that they could have such desires. And so man's free will is not violated, but God's sovereign purpose is still upheld. God's rule and reign is always maintained for the purposes of his glory. And for those who receive his mercy, he will lavish that glory upon them according to his own grace and all of his kindness toward us for all of the unending ages to come. Now, this is obviously deep stuff, but the most important thing to remember is that God is God and we are not. And we can never overplay, we can never overstate, that distinction between creator and created. We must keep it in mind at all times and therefore humble ourselves as the created before the Lord God Almighty. And when we do that, when we humble ourselves in the sight of the Lord, he will lift us up according to his own gracious promise and bring us into all of his good glory. With that, I pray you have a good and godly day, and Lord willing, I'll see you Sunday.